So please welcome Dr. Michael Womack and get ready to be overwhelmed.
Okay, I thank y'all for letting me share with y'all today. We're going to be talking about botany today, and I'm getting ready to share my slide set with y'all. It's a lot of information, and I don't want you to dwell on how much information there is. All of this is in the beginning of your book. We took this before they made the revision, but I don't think they revised this part too much in your book. And we just went straight through it and tried to explain the different things that were important in the Master Gardener book. And that's how we came up with this. It is a semester's worth of biology in 4 hours, which is really scary, but it won't be bad, because the way I look at this is I always call this practical botany, because there's two different elements that when you look at things. If you look at botany in and of itself, or a biologist, they are really worried about the scientific side of things. They look at the cell structures and all of the processes, and that is really what their whole thing is about, is understanding all that detail side of it. Horticulturists, which is what we fall under in gardening, is more worried about the practical application. You need to know some of this stuff in biology, but if you understand that, when those terms come up later on, you're going to understand what's being said. So the things that I'm talking about tonight on plants, talking about plant parts and plant functions, and the processes will be in the next session on Monday. But in that, if you understand these topics, or at least are familiar with them, listen to what I say tonight, rewatch the video later if you want, but get your book out and read it again and see if you start to understand what's being said in the book a little bit better. That's my goal, is just to let you see that practical stuff, so that later on when you're hearing some of these terms, you're hearing about transpiration, you're hearing about certain types of cells or certain types of fruit, what's a pome or a pepo, you'll have some idea what those things are. What's a compound leaf or a pinnate leaf versus a palmate leaf, some of those terms that may be out there, or different types of cells. You don't have to know it all. You're not going to have a test saying you have to go and do this. So think of it in that broader scale, trying to get a broad understanding of biology tonight. And hopefully I'll be able to show you some ways that this will be very practical, very applied, very horticultural as you go through your class. So I'm going to share my screen so you'll start seeing the slide set. So this will share the whole screen. And then I'm going to go into here. It's not gonna, let's see, give me 1 second. This part it takes me a second. Here we go. And make this full screen. Okay, now everyone should be able to see. So again, I call this practical botany, and we're going to start with talking about classifications. Classification systems are really important, and there's several different forms of classification that's out there. What we're going to start with is naming classifications, and the one that we hear about the most is nomenclature. And we use a form called binomial nomenclature, which means literally two names. Binomial means two names. And that's where we use the genus and the species to identify plants and animals. And this was a system that was developed by Carl Linnaeus back in the 1700s. We sometimes call this the scientific name. In plants, we call it the biological name sometimes. But it's this genus species system, so that you have uniformity in identifying plants. And when he came up with the system, he based everything on classifying by plant parts. Now, I'll tell you, there have been some changes. There have been more probably in the last 10 years, or 10 to 15 years as we've gotten better equipment. And then some things have been, there's a group that we call splitters and a group, we have groupers and splitters in the classification scheme of things. Some people group things together, and then another group of scientists think it's better to split everything off and create a new one, a new subset, and keep splitting it off when it may be the same thing just under a different condition. So he's basing it on plant parts. So a lot of these are based, their groupings are based on the type of stem, the type of leaf, the leaf arrangement, the type of flowering on it, the type of root system. Those are all things that we'll be discussing as we go through how classifications work. So let's start with just the real basic component of common versus scientific name. And when you look at this, if someone will tell me, which one do you think is better, a common name or a scientific name? Just anyone.
Scientific.
The scientific name, why is that?
Well, because that looks like a lot of other plants. And to me, it looks like a cast iron plant, but I don't know.
Okay. Okay. This plant here, we're going to talk about it. Scientific name, there is uniformity in scientific names. That's your genus and species. Common names, there are a lot of common names. So which is better? The scientific name is, and again, there's only one. Sometimes you'll see pseudonyms where they've changed the name, but a lot of sites will say formerly this other plant name. So, but it's a lot easier to make sure you're talking about the right plant this way, because a common name is based on things in a region. They are usually reminds people of something in an area. So you may have a lot of different common names for the same plant. For instance, the plant that's on the right of the screen, does anyone recognize this plant? I'm going to show you that this is a small one in a pot, and I'm going to show you a large trunk of one outside and the flower. If you know what it is, chime in and tell me what it looks like, if you recognize it. This is the scientific name, Pseudobombax ellipticum. Does anyone know any common names for it?
Yes, it's a shaving bush tree.
Shaving brush tree, exactly. That is the most common name. Some people will just call it Bombax tree because they've heard it. They've actually changed the name from Bombax ellipticum to Pseudobombax ellipticum. Don't know why. Someone probably needed a PhD, so they came up with the reason why it was incorrect and changed that. And I can say that because I have a doctorate in education, so I understand how that system works sometimes. But the most common name is shaving brush tree or Mexican shaving brush tree. Lots of times the area that it's most common in or originated in is added into a common name in one place, but not in another. Like if you're in Mexico, they're probably not going to call it the Mexican shaving brush tree. But if you're in Texas or you're in Florida, then they may add the word Mexican in there. So you can see there's even variations there. And there's other plants that have this shaving brush look to it, and they could call something else a shaving brush tree. So there's other things that could have that same common name. But I'm going to tell you how I'm going to introduce y'all and induct you into a very select group that will learn this plant by being the frog butt plant. And how it got this name, this is not a real common name. It is a regional name here. And pretty much it's master gardeners and a few extra select gardeners in the coastal bend that understand this plant as the frog butt plant. You go anywhere else in the world, you would probably never find this as the frog butt plant. And the reason why is when I was first married, I had one of these Pseudobombax ellipticums in my in a large pot, and it had two large branches. You can see the green trunk behind there, and it had two big branches coming out because the original plant was cut off when it was brought into America. So these two big branches stuck up, and my wife said right after we got married, she would say, that plant reminds me of a frog that is burying itself in the mud and its feet are sticking up. So she started calling it the frog butt plant. She could never remember bombax. She never saw it as a shaving brush tree because it wasn't big enough to bloom at that point. So she just called it the frog butt plant. And I always knew what she was talking about. So that's a really specific common name for a small area. But all it is what do people relate to? That's where common names come from. You look at the flower, that's where the common name of shaving brush came from, is that when the flower opens, you have all of the stamen that look like a little frilly shaving brush and the pistils that are sticking out. That is where it got its name. So again, better to learn the scientific name than the common names. When you're in an area, you're going to find a plant having a primary common name in a region. And it's okay every now and then to use that. And the more you use the scientific names, the better you are with them. If you stop using them, you will forget them. And I can tell you that from experience. I have to go back and remind myself of certain ones periodically because I don't always use them as much as I used to. But try your best to start getting familiar with scientific names. Here's another example of common names. The purple plant, does anyone know what that purple flowering plant is sometimes called?
It's Sinisa
Lisa.
or purple sage.
Sinisa.
Or purple sage.
Purple sage. Any other names? You're right. Texas sage?
Sage.
Texas sage, purple sage, anything else?
Lisa.
In some places they call it Texas silverleaf because the native form, it has that silvery color to its leaf. If you go into West Texas, it's sometimes called the barometer plant because it blooms right after it rains when the humidity is high, and that is part of its survival mechanism because you get more insects right after a rainfall, and it's more likely to have the flowers fertilized, so it is actually part of its survival mechanisms, sometimes called cenizo. The other one I've heard it called is Texas Ranger in far west Texas. But if you want to find this plant pretty much anywhere you'd want to go, call it Leucophyllum frutescens. That is the scientific name for it. The genus is the first one, always capitalized. The species is the second part of that, and it is always starts with a small letter. When you write them out, you should either underline them or if you're typing it, italicize. Either way is acceptable. Any questions on this as we move forward? We're going to do a couple others. Everyone okay so far? No news is good news. Here we go. Here's another one. Does anyone recognize this plant? I'm giving you the scientific name with the spikes on the green trunk.
Silk floss tree.
Silk floss tree is one of the common names for it. What else? How about kapok tree? That's the other one you hear around here. Another one here, this is Gaillardia grandiflora. Other names for this wildflower?
Indian blanket.
Indian blanket.
Firewheel.
Firewheel. Some people just call it Gaillardia. Those are the more common names. I'm sure there are others, but if you want to find it again, you look up Gaillardia grandiflora. So this, and the other reason why is there are different colors for the same species, which can give you a different variety or different cultivar. So what you're seeing as a firewheel here, if it's solid yellow, you may not think of it as a firewheel, but it is Gaillardia grandiflora. So some of those variations are also are taken into account when you're using a scientific name. Here's another part of confusion in common names is when we talked about this plant a few minutes ago. This is Texas sage. You know, Texas sage is in the family Scrophulariaceae. Tried to say that 3 times fast. But it is commonly called Texas sage, Leucophyllum frutescens. However, there are other plants that also go by the name sage. And the most common, one of the more common ones is Mexican bush sage, or Salvia leucantha, and it's in a completely different family. It's in the Lamiaceae family, which is the mint family. And you're probably familiar with it. It has the long, narrow, kind of soft leaves to it, and the long flower spikes with the white, usually white petals coming out of the purple. But that is in a completely different family, even though we commonly call it a sage, and that's because of the scent. That scent gives it a sage scent to it. But the common garden sage is also a different form of salvia. That's Salvia officinalis. So when you look at it, the ones that came first, I'll tell you, were the salvias. It was the common garden sage was brought over from Europe, and there were different salvias over here that also had the same scent. But when pioneers were moving across the area, they would find something, and they didn't have all of the same plants. They weren't able to bring plants with them originally, and they would find things that had similar scents or similar uses, and they would give them that same common name, because my guess is someone felt like the Texas sage either reminded them of the color of the sage leaves or a scent or something. I don't know what. But that's how those names sometimes happen regionally, with something that, like I said, is in a completely different, not just in a completely different genus, but it's in a different family too. So sages, that common name of sage can refer to a lot of things. That's the bottom line. So is that clear as mud for everyone on common versus scientific names? Okay, no news is good news. Moving on. And there's the classification systems, and this has changed slightly, but this is what we're going to use. This is what's in your book, or what was in the original book. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. That's the order that they come in. The higher you are at the top, the bigger the classification, because we're familiar with like plant kingdom and animal kingdom. Phylum or division, animals are in divisions. And then after that, the kingdom is taken, it's split up into the phylum, the phyla, and then the phyla, each phylum is then taken and split up into different classes, and each class is divided into different orders, and each order is divided into different families, and each family is divided into different genera, or a singular is genus, the plural is genera, and then those are divided into different species. And I know that this gets confusing, but I'll tell you what I think is the most important for is when people are talking about in insects, a lot of times they'll talk about a class of insects, or they'll talk about an order of insects, or sometimes a family. But what I always try to remember is the closer it is to the bottom of the list, the more closely related it is. For instance, plants that are in the same species, they're just a different cultivar, they're probably going to react exactly the same with certain environmental conditions. Plants in the same genus, like different salvias, like Salvia leucantha versus officinalis, or microphylla, which is the hot lip sage. Some of those, because they're in the same genus, they're probably going to have some of the same characteristics. But as you go up, plants in the same family, they're in the mint family. It may or may not act the same way as basil or the true mints, mentha. So because they're in the same family, but a completely different genus and species. So they're not quite as closely related if they're in the family. you talk about orders and classes. The further up you go, the less closely related it is. So it's like at the bottom, you're like brother and sister, and then you start moving into cousins and second cousins and third and fourth cousins. How many times removed as you go up the list? I know that when we have specialists, particularly the insect people, talk a lot about classes and orders, and I can't remember which is which. So I try to remember this. In college, they gave us a little system to help us remember the order: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Because I go, well, which is closer, the class or the order? I can't remember. So this is the memory helper they gave us. Kind professors cannot often fail good students. Kind professors cannot often fail good students. So here I am with that class order dilemma when they start talking about insects. I go, well, are they talking about class or order? Which is, they talk about order. It's like, well, order, professors cannot often fail, cannot often. Often is order, that means it's closer related if they're in the same order versus the same class. So some people, this works. This is what worked for me, you know, partly because I was in college, but others like this new one that I heard when I first started Extension. They used one that was King Philip came over for good spaghetti. If you're a foodie, maybe that's an easier one for you. But again, just some way of remembering those orders, which one comes first, which is the bigger grouping to the smaller groupings. So classification, this is all part of the binomial nomenclature system. Genus and species always at the bottom, that good spaghetti at the bottom, okay? Are we good? Everyone good so far?
Dr. Womack, can you talk a little bit about where cultivars and subspecies
Sure.
come
If you're
in?
talking about cultivars, at the end of a genus and species, sometimes you'll see a name you'll either see VAR, period, which means variety, or you'll see CV for cultivar or cultivated variety. That's what a cultivar is. Or you'll see that after the genus and species, you'll see a name in single quotes. That is a cultivar. It's the same genus and species, but usually it's a different color. It's one that someone has found to grow more vigorously, more compact. So it is actually like a subspecies. You might want to call it a subspecies, and it would fall on, you know. So maybe King Philip came over for good spaghetti sauce for a subspecies. Does that make sense? Does that help anyone? Because a lot you'll see things in, for instance, the Texas sage. You're going to see different forms of it. Like if you've seen Silverado sage, Silverado is a cultivar that someone found, and they said this one grows more compact. You'll see green cloud as one. It's the same genus and species, but the one with the greener leaf to it is called green cloud. But if you look anatomically, it is the same genus and species. Does that make sense to y'all?
Yes, that does.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going to move on. This is the primary naming classification system, but there are a few others that you have to experience in horticulture. So I'm going to talk about a couple other classifications that sometimes you have to deal with. So let's see. There we go. Other classification systems. First of all, within this, one of the sub-kingdoms, remember kingdoms way at the top? So between kingdom and phylum, there's a couple of sub-kingdoms. You have angiosperms and gymnosperms. The angiosperms are what we call the flowering plants. And of those, you'll hear people talking about flowering plants, and the gymnosperms are your cone-bearing plants. And so these are both sub-kingdoms. Under the division or phylum, division for animals, phylum for plants, then you go into classes. Remember, cannot often. Classes for monocots are Liliopsida versus the dicots, which is Magnoliopsida. So you can tell what they were studying when they came up with those names. This is important because you will hear the term monocots and dicots a lot during this. You may hear people talking about angiosperms, which are true flowering plants, versus gymnosperms. And those gymnosperms, of course, are the cone-bearing plants, and they're the ones with the naked seeds. And they include, believe it or not, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and the netae, which are not in our area. The big one I want you to know is the difference between monocots and dicots in the true flowering plants. Because monocots and dicots, those two classes have similarities within each one of them. And they react very differently. And you'll hear a lot of talk about them when we get into chemicals, because monocots, which are your grassy type plants, react to certain chemicals one way, and your dicots, which are your broadleaf plants, react in a completely different way to certain chemicals. So it's important for you to understand these two. So here's some of the big classification things about them. A monocot comes from the term monocotyledonous, which means one seed leaf. The cotyledon is the seed leaf, the first thing that comes out when a seed starts to germinate. And monocots are known, or one of the characteristics of them is they have a sheathed leaf attachment, which means that it will kind of wrap around the stem in a circular pattern. And you probably have seen this on corn plants and different types of grasses, and even on palm trees. You see how palm leaf. So you're going to see that sheathed leaf attachment, how it wraps around on a spot on the stem. They also have parallel venation. That means the veins go from the base to the very tip of the leaf. They go single direction. So that is another characteristic of a monocot. And your flower parts, when you look at them, they're in multiples of 3s. Your flower parts are in multiples of 3s. So the reason why you need to know some of these points about a monocot, these are the big ones, is people will come up and you go, oh, you're a master gardener. Can you help me identify this? And you're going, I don't know that. But can you find out some information that gets you in this right grouping of plants so that you kind of know how it might react? For instance, if you see that the leaf attachment is wrapped around the stem, you know that it has a sheathed leaf attachment, and it's probably going to be a monocot. Or if you look at the flower, like an orchid, I don't know if an orchid's a monocot or a dicot. You start looking at it, and it is a distinctive sets of 3. It has 6 major petals on most orchids. So it's a multiple of 3. So you know it's a monocot. You look closer, you can see the leaf attachment. You look, someone will bring you a single leaf, and you can look at the veins, and if all the veins are going up and down that leaf, you can say, oh, I'm sure that that's a monocot, at least. It's in the grass type family. So that gives you some ways to help you with your identification. And again, the grasses are the big ones, the big grouping, we call it in there. Some examples, again, a corn plant, your St. Augustine plant, palms, and besides palms, the other one I was thinking of is bamboo. People don't think about it. Think about bamboo is a giant grass plant. A palm tree, a palm is a giant grass plant. Have you thought of that? But that also means that if you're using chemicals around that are killing the grass and it's around your palm tree, if there's too much of it, it could be absorbed and it could affect the health of your palm tree. So some things like that to think about. how things react because they are somewhat closely related. They're in the same sub-kingdom. They're same, actually the monocots are the same class. So
Dr. Womack,
yes.
can you talk about some of our flowering plants that are monocots?
Flowering plants that are monocots. I just have to sit and think through them all the time. Flowering plants when you say flowering plants, I think about lilies.
Lilies,
Lots of
amaryllis.
amaryllis are in there. Irises. Think of things that have that kind of long grassy look to them. You know, even the purple fountain grasses and things like that. It's a grass, but we often think of them as flowering because you see the flower pods on them. But yeah, anything that's in that lily type, orchids are another one that's in there. So again, it's a different thing. And even some of your vines that you don't always think about are monocots, like your pothos ivy. You know, look at how those leaves are attached. They wrap around. It is a different form of a monocot, and it doesn't. The stems, you can definitely. The other part that's in there that I didn't mention here, we'll talk about the stems later on, is monocots also have bundle sheets. They don't have true rings. They have bundle sheets, so they're very fibrous stems. Okay? So we see what monocots are. Let's look at dicots, and we're going to compare them next to each other. A dicot has 2 seed leaves. So you think of a bean plant coming up. It has 2 little parts that split open, 2 little seed leaves that shrivel up. That is the cotyledon. Versus when, again, that monocot, when you see a grass come up, it's that little sheath that comes up, that single sheath that comes up. That is it. That is its seed leaf. The attachment for a dicot is what we call direct leaf attachment. We'll see some pictures in a minute. But you think about how an oak tree is attached. Excuse me. How an oak tree leaf is attached to the stem. It's in one spot, and usually when you take it off, you have a little circular mark that's called a leaf scar. That's direct leaf attachment. It doesn't wrap, the base of it doesn't wrap all the way around that stem. A hibiscus plant, think of that. Maybe a vinca plant, or you look at a begonia, you know, some things like, you know, you just start to think about plants and look at how the leaves are attached. The netted venation, again, when you look at like a maple leaf, you turn it upside down, or a sycamore leaf, more common down here, you see how the veins intertwine. They have a netted pattern, as opposed to a grass leaf or a corn leaf where they're all going up and down. So the difference between a netted venation versus the parallel venation, and the flower parts are going to be in 4s and 5s. And as I mentioned, the stem of it's going to actually be more of a woody pattern. They have more ring formations. So I'll try to remember to add that before the next time I teach this. So these are what we often call the broadleaf plants, and they include things like beans, oaks, hibiscus, sunflowers, daisies. I mean, just a huge number of plants that have that direct leaf attachment. So think about that as we move through. We're going to look at a few a little closer. Here's a picture of a monocot. This is a corn plant as it emerges from the seed. That seed coat, the seed is actually a little, what we often call kernels or something similar to that. It has, the endosperm is inside there. The endosperm, you'll learn later on, that's just a food source for the seed as it develops. It's how it gets its energy to get out of the ground. But look at when the plant is growing, think about that first shoot that comes out. You can see it on the picture. There's a little thin leaf that comes out. You can see how the leaves are have that parallel vein in them. They are all going up and down. You can see the roots. The other thing I didn't talk about were fibrous roots. Fibrous roots mean they're all about the same size. You don't go and get a palm tree, and palm trees don't have, 12-inch roots and then 3-inch roots and 2-inch roots. They're all pretty much about the same size. And there's lots and lots of them. Same thing with your grass roots. You may have a little bit of size difference, but it's not like an oak tree where you have these big, massive roots that then break off, and they keep progressively get smaller and smaller. Grasses tend to have about the same size root, and there's bunches of them. That's why they're called fibrous roots. Where your bean plant, on the other hand, when it comes out, that little round part that comes out is the cotyledon, and they will eventually shrivel. Again, that's your food source. It has the endosperm inside of the cotyledon, and it pulls it out of the ground. And then after it, as they shrivel, you'll have the first true leaves. But when you look at the first true leaves that come out, look at on a bean plant, it has netted veins. They're all intertwined and they cross over. That's what we mean by a netted vein formation. And then you look at the roots as it goes down. You typically have one or several large roots and then smaller roots that appear after that. So again, that's a dicot. And bean is the most, think of a corn plant versus a bean plant. Is everyone on the same page before we move on this? This is important, monocots and dicots. I'll take that as everyone's good. And again, if you don't remember all of this, go back and look at it in your book in a little while, and you'll go, oh yeah, I remember these things about monocots and dicots. It'll start coming back really fast. The other thing that we sometimes classify things as are, especially in horticulture, is by their life cycle. Some things are called annuals. And an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in 1 year or less. 1 year or less. I mean, some plants complete their life cycle in a matter of a week or two. Others may take a full year. Some may take multiple years. But if it can complete the life cycle, it can germinate, it can make a flower, it can make a seed in less than a year. We often call those annuals. But from a horticultural standpoint, some of that is based on some plants will biologically only live a certain amount of time. You cannot make them live too much longer because they only are going to last a certain amount of time. Now they'll make more and continue on from other seeds or other propagation methods. But usually in horticulture, we're just talking about plants that are short term. They're used for a short term. And we think of annuals as our flowers, your coleus, your petunias, things like that. Even a lot of our herbs are annuals that we replant them every year. We don't expect them to last a long time. They'll flower after a couple of months and move on. Even your vegetables will do that. Another term you sometimes hear in horticulture is a biennial, and this is a plant that completes its life cycle in 2 years, or sometimes we talk about 2 growing seasons. So the whole point of this one, we're not real hard and fast on, it's more than 12 months and it's less than 24 months, and that's what makes it a biennial. And in the first 12 months, it can only do this. It can only have vegetative growth. Well, your vegetative growth is going to be, it's producing roots and stems and leaves. And for some plants, that's really important. They have to have that initial growth so that it's ready to go into the reproductive cycle. It has to, if it doesn't have a big enough root system, if it doesn't have certain things that have matured with stems, then it's not ready physically to support the flowering and the fruit and the seeds later on, the reproductive side the second year. Some things, vernalization, which is going to be cold periods, can also change plants from the vegetative state into the reproductive state, and thus some plants can complete their life cycle that may normally take more than a year and usually 2 years in less time if they go through a cold period. That's a type of dormancy in between. But a great example of asparagus, asparagus is one of those plants that if you plant it from seed, it's going to take it 2 years to produce, because what we want to eat, the asparagus that we typically eat, we want to eat those flower heads, and that's not going to happen the first year. So that's why you're buying plantlets. Cabbage is grown really as an annual because you start it from seed and you want it to produce the leaves. But after a period of time, it will actually bolt, and it can then, it takes a second year for it, or a second growing season, to switch from vegetative making leaves into the reproductive side. Some of the others that are sometimes considered, and again, this is not hard and fast, but some of the ones that you sometimes see linked in as a biennial at times, or have two distinctive growing periods, are parsley and hollyhocks and onions. So those are just some things that are sometimes there. Again, a distinctive time of vegetative growth, and then it transitions and it's almost completely reproductive growth. So you're not going to get more leaves and stems after that. And then the other one we sometimes have are perennials. So you have an annual, 1 year, biennial, 2 years, perennial, many, many years. And that's what we classify our shrubs in, hibiscus and esperanza and rosemary, those things. A lot of our herbaceous plants that can last for multiple years. You hear us talking about planting perennials in your yard. A lot of our ornamental grasses are perennials. These are just some examples that were thrown out there. Horticulturally, this is not nice and clean. Horticulturists are not clean. This is what drives a lot of your biologists crazy about horticulture. Biologists are all about the detail, and it has to be exact. Where horticulturists are, well, it grows for about a year, and that's how we use it. So we use things as annuals, and they'll go, oh no, it's not. So that's where you sometimes can get into a fun conversation with a true biologist at times. Looking at that. Now, again, these are not hard and fast, and a few examples about life cycles. One of the ones that's out there is this. There's a word that we use, particularly here in the warm winters, is a plant can sometimes, quote, perennialize. And that's a plant that normally, most of the areas, it's only grown for less than a year. But in our area, it may grow for multiple years. And the most common one that I always started with, I thought about, was vinca or periwinkles, because most of the places plant that for that one-time color. It's short, it's done. That's what it's there for. So it is an annual for most people. But down here, it doesn't get that cold. It grows, and I've had vinca at my mom's house in Rockport for 10 years in some places. It's a perennial in that space. But if you go just about anywhere else in the northern part of the country, you say it's perennial, they're going to think you're crazy. However, they have their own set of issues up there because they will use some tender plants as an annual. For instance, when I was in Chicago a few years ago, they were planting hibiscus and they were calling them annuals because they only expected it to grow for 6 months during the warm part of the summer. And once the cold weather came, it was going to get ripped out. So they were planting it like an annual. They considered firebush to be an annual because it was going to freeze back. And for us, those are obvious perennials. So again, it's how it's being used. But in terms of when you have that Master Gardener quiz that you have to take, remember an annual completes the life cycle in 1 year. Biennial is 2 years, bi meaning 2, and that a perennial lasts for many years. That's the clean and easy form of it. So again, horticulture is as clear as mud. Does everyone feel totally confused right now? In fact,
No,
what I'm
this
going to do,
is
just
great. Thank you.
I just want to look at some faces for just a second and see how y'all, maybe I'm not. Here we go. So let me go in and show anyone. Okay. Does that help y'all a little bit? Again, the whole purpose of this is trying to give you some of these terms, get you familiar with them, and there's almost always exceptions. In biology, there's almost always an exception. Just remember that. Okay? Okay, I'm going to take a drink of water and a deep breath, and then we'll probably take about 15 more minutes, and I'm sure y'all will need to take a short break for 5 minutes or so. Is that going to happen, Kevin?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so going back to the full screen, let's see, slideshow down at the bottom. Here we go. And I'm going to minimize all of y'all. Actually, I can put you on the side there and still see who, then I can see sometimes you can say something and just nod your head. So I know what's going on. Okay, so we did perennials. The other classification thing, and we've kind of talked about parts of this, are weeds have specific classifications. And with this, it's really important to understand this. This is where that monocot dicot thing came. We talk about grasses, which are monocots. We have broadleaves, which are our dicots. Remember, those are what we talked about. But there's this other group that was in there, which you sometimes hear people talk about separately, and that's sedges. In fact, if you still subscribe to the Color Times, I got an article on sedges this weekend. But they are monocots. They are a specific family of Cyperaceae, but they're unique grasses in that they have this triangular shape. They are very waxy. And I'll tell you, in terms of weeds, they are hard as heck to get rid of. So that is the big thing with them. They are a monocot. And some of those monocot herbicides will work on them, but they need some help because of the waxy coating on them. And so there are some chemicals that they've made that stick better, and so those are some of the sedge weed killers. And that's really what it's about. The mode of action, how a chemical is absorbed by a plant and used by a plant, and sometimes kills that plant, is what we mean by mode of action of a chemical. And so when you're talking about weeds or weed killers, you sometimes hear about a grass weed killer or a broadleaf weed killer, or sometimes you hear them talk about broad spectrum. That means it kills everything. It kills the grasses, it kills the broadleaves, and if you're lucky, it'll kill those sedges as well. But it's about the mode of action. So that's why when we talk about weeds, that's how they classify those typically. Okay, everyone good? Moving on. Let's talk about zones. Here's another one that's a big mess. Lots of times you'll hear plants are in this zone. This is a zone 9 plant, or this lives in zone 5 through 8 or whatever. Zone is based on the USDA plant hardiness zone map. That is what the original plant zones were based on. That means the USDA created this map saying what's the average cold temperature in different areas, and they created this map with these bands or zones in them based on the average cold temperature. And each zone is a 10-degree temperature. And so it's based on the lowest average temperature, in this range. And there are 10 zones that are recognized by USDA. It's because there's 10 zones in the United States. So with that, we sometimes misuse this because it should only be this plant will grow in this area because it will freeze if it's in a higher zone, in a smaller zone. So a zone 10 plant will freeze in zone 8. And that's really the way it's only supposed to be used. That's how it was developed. But you know, we're horticulturists. We love to go in and mess things up and make it practical for us. And so what we sometimes talk about is this plant will grow in these zones. So it takes account the coldest it'll grow into some of those zones. When you move down, you'll see they progressively get hotter for longer periods of time. So we will talk about this is a zone 3 through 6 plant, but really it's a zone 3 plant because it's based on the coldest it will take before it dies. So If you see something says it grows in zone 3 through 6, it's a zone 3 plant. Something says it grows in zone 5 to 9, it's really what zone plant?
A 5.
It's a 5. It's technically a zone 5 plant. So as long as you understand that is the coldest temperature it can take before it freezes. That's what it's based on. And here's the map that was redeveloped a few years ago. You'll see there's brown kind of a salmony brown colors at the bottom. That's zone 9, the bottom. And what they've done with each of the zones to make it even easier for you is they divide it up into zone A and zone B. So like 9B is the very bottom part of Texas. You'll see there's a little bit in Florida over there. And if you go across to Florida and then deep into northern Mexico, you'll see one more color. That's zone 10, kind of that pale pink color, almost whitish. That's zone 10, which is the tip of Florida and the Florida Keys, and really Mexico. And then you go up, the green colors, kind of olive colors above us, that's going to be zone 8. The pinkish colors above that are going to be zone 7. The yellow colors are zone 6. The green colors are zone 5. The blue colors are zone 4. The orange colors are zone 3. So you can see how that moves right on up. Okay, I'm going to show this to you in a couple different forms. This is the official USDA one. I've blown up Texas a little bit. You can see how 9B is the valley. 9A is a lot of the Texas coast to including us and out towards Laredo. So you look at 9B, it says that our average coldest temperature down in deep South Texas is about 30 to 25 degrees. That's what the average coldest temperature is in that area. And it may not happen every year, but it's pretty common to get a cold temperature every 3 or 4 years in the 25 to 30 degree range. We're in zone 9A, and you can see that's the lighter salmon color. And that says that the average annual minimum temperature is somewhere between 20 to 25. We don't get that a lot of years, but that's just us at the coast. You go a little further inland, it's pretty common for George West to get in 25 degrees, 24 degrees. That's the average temperature. So realize that there are exceptions. And even as you go up, you'll see in the zone H, you'll see those little pink areas that are pop up. That's probably higher elevations in there that get colder in the hill country. So again, you kind of see these are based on averages that have been collected for 100+ years. So that's what it means, okay? So there's a simplified version in Texas. You can see all the counties in Texas this way. That might help you if you hear someone say that they're from San Antonio or this county. You can kind of see where their county falls in the zone, maybe a little easier that way. The other one that's out there, let's just make this even more confusing, is there's also a whole classification system that talks about chilling hours, chilling zones. And those, thank goodness, are in the hundreds. So you have this 200 level, the 400 level, 600, 7, 8. And what this is looking at is plants that are going dormant. Those plants that are going dormant in the winter, they need to accumulate a certain number of hours that's between like 32 and 50 degrees to let them know that winter is over. Because you notice as you get further up into Texas, northern areas, your amount gets higher. It means you have to have more cold weather before those plants will start bursting out with flowers or leaves for the spring. It senses with chemicals in the plant how long winter has occurred. And this is you think that we had confusion in the plant zone stuff. This is really confusing because when you have temperatures below 32, you don't accumulate chilling hours. And then you have a range that like from 32 degrees, 33 degrees, up to about 35, 36 degrees. It's pretty much an hour to hour. 1 hour in that temperature range gives you 1 hour of chilling units. Then you go into the upper 30s, maybe 1 hour in the upper 30s is more like 8/10 of an hour or 3/4 of an hour. You get into the low 40s, you're probably, half an hour. 1 hour in the mid 40s is probably like a half hour accumulation, because it's not as effective at that point. And once you get past 50, you're accumulating very little, and above 55 you actually start losing chill hours. So you have warm days, then some of those chilling hours that have been accumulated, the plant starts changing chemicals within it, and it actually loses some of that. So you can't have just one short cold snap that causes a plant to break its dormancy. This is the scientific study of how these accumulate and the models that have been created through the years. I worked with modeling on azalea dormancy for about 3.5 years at the University of Florida, and it's really very complex. But you see this with blueberries, you see it with a lot of your fruit trees, your temperate fruit trees, because those temperate plants are used to a certain amount of cold. And so those temperate fruit trees are going to be your apples, your peaches, pears, plums. So lots of different fruit trees need to know when it's winter. And even you'll see a fruit tree, you look at different peaches, you'll see that some peaches need 300 chill units or they need 500 chill units. You can kind of see where they can grow or not grow. Because if you plant a tree that is the wrong variety, that needs more cold units down here, I mean, I know people that are from Dallas, and they go, well, I had this peach tree and I love this variety and I want to plant it when I moved down to Rockport to retire, and it never blooms. They go, what's wrong with it? It's like, it wasn't cold enough, long enough, because that tree was adapted to a colder area. Winter Texans, y'all will have winter Texans at some point. They love peonies. It's not cold enough for peonies down here. So peonies are a cold weather temperate plant that won't grow down here. But even people that like Fredericksburg peaches, you see Fredericksburg's in that 600-700 zone, right in through there, probably closer to 700. They'll find a peach tree up there and they'll love it, and they'll bring it down here, and we're 400 if we're lucky on a cold year, and it doesn't bloom right. It doesn't bloom hardly at all. So you have to match the chill units based on where those plants originated. And that's a cultivar. Back to, it's the same genus and species of peach, but certain cultivars, they're cultivated they've been adapted to this temperature range, and they can sense when winter is over that way. So here's what it looks like in the United States, and this is where you start looking at things, particularly like, say, blueberries, peaches, plums, apples. Apples are a big thing because apples are hard to grow down here because most apple varieties need a lot of chill units, and we just don't have enough. We just don't get enough down here in South Texas. You may get them up in Dallas in the 1,000, 1,200 area, and you go further north, there's more than that. So with that, that's kind of our classifications. And I'd like to take a short 5-minute break or so if that works for everyone.
That works just fine. So we'll come back at 6:45.
Right. I have 6:40 right now. 6:45 sounds great. Thanks.